welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental. It's about our personal values.
Yeah, how we see the world, how we see each other.
Exactly, and specifically we're exploring whether people across different cultures, really have different core values.
Or is it more about how those values get expressed?
Yeah.
How they show up day to day?
That's the question. So our mission for you, listener, is to unpack this. We're diving into research comparing Brazil, India, and the UK.
It's fascinating stuff.
Think of it as like a shortcut to understanding maybe why someone from a different background acts differently, even if you fundamentally agree on the big principles.
You might have a real aha moment here. It could genuinely change how you view some cross-cultural interactions.
Okay, so where are we drawing from today?
Well, primarily there's this key study that's called Cross-Cultural Differences and Similarities in Human Value Instantiation. Really, it's to the heart of it.
Instantiation. We'll unpack that term, I promise.
We will. And we'll also bring in some broader ideas.
Yeah.
About social values, ethical thinking, just to round things out.
Because you hear this a lot, right? These ideas about cultural clashes, maybe driven by different values, sometimes based on surveys even.
Right, but then you also see these big international studies showing, actually, quite a lot of agreement on the basics across many, many nations.
So which is it? What's really going on?
That's what we want to explore. What explains these apparent contradictions?
Okay, let's get into it. When we say values in this context, what are we actually talking about? Lay the groundwork for us.
Okay, so values at their core are these abstract guiding principles. They're the ideals that sort of shape our goals, our behavior.
Like honesty or kindness.
Exactly. And researchers, like Shalom Schwartz, have mapped out these fundamental value types that seem pretty common everywhere. Things like, caring for others, benevolence, or striving for achievement, power, self-direction.
10 basic types, I think.
10 basic types, yeah. And Schwartz also grouped them into these higher order dimensions, like openness versus conservation, or self-transcendence versus self-enhancement.
Sort of bigger competing priorities.
Kind of. Like how much you value new experiences versus sticking to tradition, or focusing on others' well-being versus your own goals.
And the surprising thing you mentioned is the global agreement.
Yeah, generally there's quite a high consensus on which values matter most. Things like benevolence, universalism, self-direction, they often rank highest pretty much everywhere.
And things like power or tradition are often lower.
Often lower, yes. So there's this common ground on the abstract level.
Okay, so if we tend to agree on these big ideas, where do the cultural differences actually, come into play?
Well, that's where this idea of instantiation is key. It's a bit academic sounding, but...
Break it down for us.
Okay, think of it like this. We might all value, say, creativity. That's the abstract idea. But what does being creative actually look like? What's a concrete example? Is it painting a picture? Is it solving a problem in a novel way? Is it cooking something new?
Okay. The specific action or situation.
Exactly. Gregory Mayo talked about levels of value representation. There's the big system level, then the abstract value itself, like creativity. But this third level, instantiation, that's the specific behaviors, the situations. That's where the action is, so to speak.
And that's the level this main study focused on.
Precisely. The researchers thought maybe the real cultural differences aren't so much in valuing creativity itself, but in what counts as creativity in everyday life.
Got it. This makes sense. So tell us about study 1, Brazil, India, the UK. What did they do?
Right, so the goal of study 1 was basically to identify the typical behaviors or situations people in those 3 countries connect with 23 different values.
How'd they do that? Just ask them.
Pretty much, yeah. They asked university students to describe a situation where a particular value was important to them. Who was involved? What did they do? What happened?
So getting concrete examples.
Exactly. It builds on older methods, like concept mapping, where you try to see how people connect ideas. They wanted to map out how these abstract values become concrete.
And they expected differences between the countries.
They did, because, people live in different social environments, different cultural contexts, different economic situations.
And these 3 countries are quite different on those fronts.
Absolutely. The paper mentions things like levels of economic development, perceptions of corruption, even things like climate and resource availability.
How might that influence things? Give us an example.
Well, take equality. In a country where corruption is perceived as a bigger problem, like maybe Brazil in the study's context, thinking about equality might immediately bring to mind examples related to fighting unfairness, systemic issues.
Whereas somewhere else it might be different.
Perhaps. Or protecting the environment. If you live somewhere with water shortages, conserving water might be a very common top-of-mind example, less so where water is abundant.
Makes sense. So they gathered all these descriptions. Then what?
They analyze them, both quantitatively, like counting word frequencies, and qualitatively, really reading through to understand the themes and context. They used a software called Iramutek for some of the analysis.
Okay. And what jumped out? What were the key findings?
Well, one of the really big findings, perhaps counterintuitive, was that there was generally more variety in the examples within each country than between the countries.
Hang on. More variation inside Brazil than between Brazil and the UK, for example.
On average, yes, across the values. Which kind of suggests that maybe the way individuals express values is quite personal, even within the same culture.
Interesting. But there were some between-country differences, right?
Oh, definitely. They looked at examples that were mentioned really frequently, like by at least half the participants in one country.
Okay, like what?
For instance, in Brazil, a super common example for protecting the environment was simply throwing garbage in a bin. Very practical, everyday thing.
Okay.
In the UK, art came up frequently as an instantiation of creativity.
In India.
Interestingly, the Indian sample had fewer of these really high-frequency, widely shared examples for the specific values they looked at.
How might that be?
The researchers don't definitively say, but it could relate to various factors, maybe even the nature of the task or language nuances in the responses.
Gotcha. Did they notice anything else, like overlaps?
Yes, that was another key point. The same kind of action or idea could pop up as an example for different values.
Oh, so one behavior could mean different things.
Or be seen as reflecting different underlying values, yeah. For example, the idea of something new was linked to ambition, but also being daring, having a varied life, creativity, even broad-mindedness.
Wow, okay.
And support could relate to family security and loyalty. Work came up for success, ambition, and creativity.
It's complex.
It really is. And they found some specific cultural links too. Like in Brazil, wealth was often tied to family life, and social power sometimes connected to social responsibility.
Fascinating connections. You mentioned India wasn't in the second study.
That's right. The researchers noted that the quality or detail of the open-ended responses from the Indian sample, possibly due to English not being the first language for many participants in that kind of qualitative task, made it difficult to use them reliably for the next stage. So study 2 focused just on Brazil and the UK.
Okay, so study 1 mapped out the kinds of examples people generate. What was the point of study 2 then?
Study 2 flipped the question, really. It asked, okay, if we take these examples, even the ones that are common in just one country, will people in the other countries still recognize what value they represent?
So can they connect the dots even if it's not their usual example?
Exactly. Like if throwing trash in a bin is a common Brazilian example for environmental protection, would people in the UK look at that action and say, yeah, that relates to protecting the environment?
Okay, makes sense. How did they test that?
They created a list of 138 of these specific examples. Some were typical for the UK from study 1, some typical for Brazil, some typical for both, and some were exploratory new ones.
A big list.
A decent list, yeah. And participants from both Brazil and the UK saw each example and had to pick the value it best represented from a set of 6 options.
Yeah. Did they agree?
Largely, yes. That was the main finding. Most examples were matched to their intended values pretty well in both countries. Yeah. Even if the example wasn't one commonly generated in their own country back in study 1.
So people could recognize it even if it wasn't top of mind for them.
Precisely. The researchers used this great analogy. It's like recognizing an ostrich as a bird. Even if your typical mental image of a bird is a robin, you still get the category.
Okay, I like that. Ostrich as a bird. It suggests that the underlying understanding of the value, the category, is shared.
Exactly. It points to a shared understanding of the abstract values. But there were some really interesting differences too, where the matching did differ significantly between Brazil and the UK.
Ooh, okay, tell us about those. Those seem important.
Definitely. So for example, the action traveling. In Brazil, participants strongly linked that to pleasure.
Okay.
But in the UK, it was more strongly linked to freedom.
Huh. Same action, different primary value association.
Right. Another one, maintaining a good work-life balance. In Brazil, that was seen as an example of success.
Achieving success means having balance.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
But in the UK, it was more associated with having a varied life.
Interesting distinction.
Yeah. And being able to buy organic food. In the UK, that was linked pretty clearly to wealth.
Makes sense. It can be more expensive.
But in Brazil, there wasn't a strong link like that in their data.
Okay. Any others?
A couple more really stand out. Living your own life and not following the crowd. In Brazil, this was connected to self-discipline.
Self-discipline, to not follow the crowd.
Yeah, which is interesting because in the UK, it was linked to freedom. And the researchers point out that according to Schwartz's model, freedom and self-discipline are usually seen as coming from different motivations. So that Brazilian link is quite thought-provoking.
It really is. One more.
Last one. Customer service. In Brazil, this was sometimes seen as relating to social justice.
Social justice. How so?
The researchers speculate it might relate back to those concerns about fairness, maybe corruption, ensuring everyone gets fair treatment in service interactions. Whereas in the UK, it was more straightforwardly linked to helpfulness.
Wow. Okay, those differences are quite revealing about potentially different cultural lenses on the same actions.
They really are.
So let's pull back. We have study 1 showing lots of variation within countries, but some distinct common examples. Study 2 showing shared recognition, but also these key differences in matching. What's the big picture message here?
Well, the main takeaway seems to be that while the spontaneous examples of our values, the instantiations, can differ quite a bit across cultures, and even within them.
Like the ostrich versus the robin.
Exactly. The underlying understanding of the abstract value itself seems to be shared to a significant degree. That high variation within countries in Study 1. The researchers suggest it might be because values often operate as truisms.
Truisms, meaning?
Things we hold to be true but don't often think about or consciously define. They feel obvious. So we don't have heavily rehearsed definitions or examples ready to go, leading to more very personal responses.
It's like we just assume everyone knows what respect looks like, but the way we show it might be quite different, and we don't even notice we're being different.
That's a great way to put it. And the researchers are good about noting limitations, too. Study 1 relied on spontaneous recall, so people might just not mention really common things because they take them for granted.
Like it's too obvious to say?
Possibly. To give an example, in Brazil, participants mentioned issues relating to Black people and women when talking about a lack of equality. That didn't really come up in the UK responses in the same way. Doesn't mean it's not relevant, but maybe not the first thing people spontaneously offered in that context.
Right, context matters.
Context, what's salient, what feels necessary to state, and of course these were student samples. So we need a bit of caution generalizing to entire nations. How you instantiate success might be different if you're 20 versus 50.
Sure, passing entrance exams might be a student thing for success.
Exactly. And they also noted a gender imbalance in the samples, mostly female, which is common in psychology research, but still a limitation.
Okay, so how does all this loop back to our original question about cross-cultural differences in values? What's the answer?
The research strongly suggests that when we observe cultural differences in behavior, it might often be less about having fundamentally different core values and more about having different, typical, readily accessible examples, different instantiations of those shared values.
So the disagreement isn't necessarily on the principle, but on what the principle looks like in action.
That seems to be a big part of the story, yes. It challenges the simple idea of culture as this monolithic thing where everyone shares the exact same understanding of how to behave based on values. The picture is more nuanced.
And if we briefly bring in those other ideas you mentioned, ethical framework, social values.
Right, they add layers. Different ethical perspectives like focusing on rights versus maximizing good can lead people to act differently even if they share a value like fairness.
Okay.
And our own personal leanings, psychologists talk about social value orientation, whether you're generally more pro-social or pro-self.
Focused on others or yourself.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
That connects to which values you prioritize, like benevolence versus power, and that influences behavior too. And then broader social trends, cultural beliefs about things like justice, freedom, respect, they shape the context in which values are understood and expressed. Society changes, and maybe the common instantiations change too.
It all interconnects. Values, behavior, context, individual differences.
It's a complex web, but understanding the instantiation piece is crucial.
Okay, so to wrap this up for our listener, if you had to boil it down, what's the key thing to take away from this deep dive?
I'd say the main point is this. While core abstract values show considerable similarity across cultures, the specific ways these values are put into action, how they're instantiated in daily life, can vary a lot.
Because of culture, context, personal experience.
All of that. But crucially, this variation in expression doesn't automatically mean people disagree on the core principles. They might just have different go-to examples in their heads.
And that's the aha moment we hoped for.
I think so. Recognizing this gap or this difference between the abstract value and its concrete examples, that's powerful.
How so?
Well, it can help bridge cultural divides. If you see someone acting in a way that seems odd according to your understanding of a value, maybe you can pause and consider if their action might actually stem from the same value, just expressed differently. It promotes understanding over judgment.
Better intercultural communication, fewer misunderstandings, hopefully.
That's the potential, yeah.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. So here's a final thought for you, listener, to chew on. Think about one of your most important values. Got it. Now, what are the first, say, 3 specific examples that pop into your head of that value in action? Things you do or things you see as representing it? Right. Now, try to imagine someone from a completely different background. Maybe from one of the countries in the study, maybe just someone with very different life experiences. How might they exemplify that exact same value, but in a way that you wouldn't immediately think of, or maybe wouldn't even recognize at first?
It's a great exercise.
Think about the misunderstandings that could potentially arise just from those different ways of showing the same